The thing about small-town committees is they look harmless until you join one. I'd been living in Willow Creek, Indiana, for 3 years when I got roped into the Parks and Rec Committee. On paper, it sounded simple. Help decide where new benches should go, maybe pick out flowers for the community garden. In reality, it was a monthly battlefield over budgets, petty grudges, and who got credit for projects that barely mattered to anyone outside that cramped meeting room. I worked from home as a technical writer, which apparently made me flexible in the eyes of my neighbor Janet. She was the committee chair, the kind of person who calls a vote before anyone else finishes speaking, then claims it was unanimous. When she knocked on my door last spring, she pitched it like a favor. Just a few hours a month, nothing too intense. I agreed, mostly to avoid looking like the antisocial newcomer. The first meeting shattered that illusion. 6 people sat around a folding table in the community center, armed with binders thicker than the town phone book. One guy, Mark, argued that the basketball court needed new lighting because teenagers were loitering after dark. Another, Doris, insisted we should cut all sports funding and put the money into a butterfly garden. By the time it was my turn to speak, I realized everyone already had allies and enemies, and I was walking into old fights mid-round. Still, I thought I could keep my head down, offer a few practical suggestions, and slip out unnoticed. That plan lasted exactly 1 week, until an email chain started about a grant application for a major park improvement. The words sounded harmless. The fight they triggered? Not even close. The grant was for $25,000, huge money for a town our size. The email came from Janet, full of exclamation points about transforming our green spaces. She'd attached a half-finished proposal and a note saying we'd finalize it at the next meeting. No one asked who wrote it or how the ideas got there. I read through it twice. Half the budget was earmarked for a heritage pavilion, complete with engraved plaques honoring key contributors. The other half was vaguely labeled beautification. No breakdown, no cost estimates, nothing concrete. I wasn't an accountant, but even I could see the numbers were more wishful thinking than planning. When we met, Janet opened by saying, "We're all in agreement, right?" It wasn't a question, it was a trap. Doris cleared her throat and said she'd support it if we replaced the pavilion with her butterfly garden. Mark interrupted, saying the whole budget should go to lighting upgrades and security cameras. They bickered for 10 minutes straight, voices getting sharper, before Janet turned to me. "You've been quiet. Thoughts?" I wanted to say, "Why are we pretending this is about the park when it's clearly about whose name goes on a plaque?" Instead, I asked how the cost estimates were calculated. Silence. Janet blinked, then mumbled something about ballpark figures. That's when I realized no one here cared about the grant as much as they cared about controlling it. After the meeting, Mark caught me in the parking lot. "You seem reasonable," he said, lowering his voice. "We could really use another vote on our side." It wasn't a friendly suggestion, it was recruitment. And if I didn't pick a side soon, I had a feeling I'd end up everyone's enemy by default. I spent the next week dodging phone calls. Mark left 2 voicemails about urgent committee matters. Doris slipped a handwritten note into my mailbox, inviting me over for tea to discuss strategy. Even Janet showed up at my door one evening with a Tupperware of brownies and a sales pitch about how the pavilion would be a lasting legacy for the town. It wasn't that I didn't care about the park. I liked the idea of improving it. But every conversation had the same undertone: support me, and I'll make sure your ideas get funding. It felt less like community service and more like small-town lobbying. By the time the next meeting rolled around, I decided to push for a neutral option, use the grant for basic maintenance and upgrades everyone could agree on. New benches, better trash bins, a fresh coat of paint on the playground equipment. No grand gestures, no names on plaques. I figured if I framed it as something for everyone, maybe they'd go for it. It went exactly how you'd expect. Janet said it lacked vision. Mark said it didn't address security concerns. Doris accused me of gutting the town's natural beauty. I kept my tone calm, but inside, I was starting to wonder why I'd signed up for this at all. Then, in the middle of the arguing, a man I barely recognized, Tom, apparently the treasurer, cleared his throat. "Before we vote on anything," he said, "I think the committee should know there's something unusual about this grant money. The room went quiet in a way it never had before. Tom was the kind of guy who barely spoke in meetings, so when he did, everyone actually listened. He opened a folder and pulled out a copy of the grant terms. "It's not just free money," he said. "There's a matching requirement. For every dollar we spend, the town has to match it from our own budget. That means if we take the full $25,000, we need to find another $25,000 somewhere else." Mark frowned. "We've never had trouble covering small grants before." "This isn't small," Tom replied. "And here's the kicker. If we can't match it by the deadline, we have to return the entire amount, with interest." The room shifted. Even Janet's confident posture faltered. Suddenly, the fight over plaques and gardens looked a lot less shiny. I could see the mental math on their faces. The town budget was already stretched thin, and asking for another $25,000 from taxpayers would not go over well. I asked Tom why no one knew about this earlier. He said the matching clause was buried in the fine print, and he only noticed it because the grant administrator sent a reminder email to the treasurer's office. Janet muttered something about administrative oversight, but it sounded flimsy. That's when the real scramble began. Instead of debating which project to pick, the conversation turned to how to raise matching funds. Bake sales and donation drives got thrown out like we could somehow fund a pavilion with cupcakes. It was all over the place, until Tom added, "There might be one way to cover it without hitting taxpayers, but it's complicated." Everyone leaned in, even me. Tom explained that the town owned a strip of unused land near the highway, basically a weed-covered stretch no one visited. A developer had been sniffing around for months, offering to buy it for commercial use. If we sold it, the money could cover the grant match entirely. Janet's eyes lit up. "That's perfect. We get the grant, we fund the project, and we finally do something with that eyesore." Mark was more cautious. "What's the catch?" Tom hesitated. "The catch is that selling the land would need council approval, and there's a clause in the deed about it being reserved for public use. We'd have to get that restriction lifted, and some folks in town won't like the idea of losing public land, even if no one's using it." Doris shook her head immediately. That land was meant for green space. Once it's gone, it's gone. She looked right at me when she said it, like she expected me to side with her. I stayed quiet, but my brain was spinning. On one hand, selling the land would solve the money problem without raising taxes. On the other, it would drag us into a whole new fight with people outside the committee, and I wasn't sure I had the patience for another round of small-town politics. Janet, of course, moved to put the sale on the table for discussion at the next meeting. She made it sound procedural, but I could tell she'd already decided. And judging by the look Mark gave me on the way out, he thought my vote might decide how this all ended. In the days before the next meeting, I got a crash course in just how quickly rumors move in a small town. By Monday, people were stopping me in the grocery store to ask if I was really going to sell off our parkland. On Tuesday, a woman I barely knew cornered me at the post office with a 5-minute speech about protecting nature for future generations. By Wednesday, someone slipped a flyer under my windshield wiper warning about outsiders trying to profit off community assets. The thing was, I wasn't even on either side yet, but in Willow Creek, staying quiet meant people decided for you. Mark called at night, frustrated. "You know they're going to spin this sale like it's the end of the town's character. But think about it, when's the last time anyone actually set foot on that land?" He wasn't wrong. It was scrubby grass, broken fencing, and maybe one picnic table sinking into the dirt. Still, I could already hear the arguments from people like Doris, that once you sell land, you never get it back. At the meeting, the air was different. The usual petty jabs were gone. Everyone knew the stakes were bigger now. Janet opened with a long pitch about responsible growth and turning underused assets into meaningful investments. Doris countered with a binder full of old town plans promising the land would remain public. Then it was my turn. Every face turned toward me like I was about to hand down a verdict. I took a breath, ready to speak, when Tom interrupted. He said there was one more detail about the developer's offer we hadn't heard yet, and it might change everything. Tom set a single-page letter on the table. "The developer's offer isn't just for the land," he said. "They want a long-term tax abatement, 10 years without paying property taxes." That landed like a rock in water. Even Janet's face tightened. Mark leaned forward. So they want us to give them the land and let them skate on taxes for a decade? Not exactly, Tom said. They'd still pay after 10 years. But yeah, that's the trade-off they're asking for. In their words, it's to offset development costs. I could feel the shift in the room. Selling land was one thing. Selling land and giving away future revenue was another. Doris seized on it immediately. This is a bad deal. You give up public land, and you don't even get tax money back for years? That's not investment, that's a giveaway. Janet tried to pivot, saying we could negotiate the abatement down, maybe 5 years instead of 10. But I could tell she was doing the math in her head. Even with the grant match covered, losing years of tax income meant other projects would suffer down the line. All eyes were back on me again. It wasn't just about the grant anymore. It was about whether I was willing to put the committee's short-term win ahead of the town's long-term stability. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked Tom what the timeline was for deciding. He said the developer's offer expired in 2 weeks, which meant we had exactly 1 meeting left before the choice was made, and no room for second guesses. That final week before the vote was chaos. The debate spilled out of the committee and into the whole town. The local paper ran an editorial calling the sale short-sighted. A Facebook group popped up overnight, full of people posting drone photos of the land with captions about losing our last open space. At the same time, business owners started emailing the committee about how the development could bring jobs and modernize Willow Creek. I tried to stay neutral in public, but it was impossible. My phone buzzed constantly, Mark forwarding me articles about similar developments boosting small-town economies, Doris sending me scanned copies of the original land deed with a public use clause highlighted in yellow. Even Tom broke his usual quiet streak, stopping by my house to say, "Look, I just want the facts to be clear before you vote. Once this goes through, it can't be undone." The night before the meeting, I sat at my kitchen table with both stacks of papers in front of me. The economic projections Mark gave me and the preservation arguments Doris had compiled. They both had valid points, but they both conveniently left out the parts that didn't fit their case. In the end, I wrote down 3 questions I'd need answered before I could vote. How much would the development really benefit us financially? What protections could we secure if we did sell? And most importantly, was the grant even worth all this if it meant fracturing the town in the process? I didn't sleep much that night, and by the time I walked into the meeting room the next day, I had the feeling nothing about this vote would be clean. The meeting room was packed, standing room only, with people lining the walls and spilling into the hallway. I'd never seen that many residents show up for a Parks and Rec vote. The mayor even slid into a chair in the back, arms crossed, clearly there to gauge the political fallout. Janet called the meeting to order, her voice brighter than usual, like she was trying to project confidence. She launched straight into the developer's offer, this time acknowledging the tax abatement but framing it as an incentive for growth. Doris countered with a short, sharp statement about public land being a trust, not a bargaining chip. The crowd reacted audibly to both, murmurs for Janet, applause for Doris. Then Tom stepped in with numbers. He laid out exactly how much tax revenue we'd lose during the abatement, and how long it would take to recoup it. The silence in the room was heavy. Even the mayor leaned forward. When it was my turn, I stood up instead of speaking from my seat. I asked the developer's rep, who was sitting near the front, if they'd be willing to shorten the abatement to 3 years and agree to maintain a portion of the land as public green space. They said they'd consider it, but their tone made it sound like a no. That answer was all I needed. I told the room I couldn't support the deal as it stood, not because I was against development, but because the cost outweighed the benefit. My voice was steady, but I could feel the tension spike. The vote was called immediately after. When the count was read, 4 against, 3 in favor, the room erupted. Half cheered, half groaned. And in the middle of it all, Janet shot me a look I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to calculation. The meeting cleared out slowly, with people stopping me on the way to the door to either thank me or tell me I'd just killed the town's future. I nodded politely to both. Mark avoided eye contact entirely. Doris gave me a small, satisfied smile, the kind that said she thought I'd been on her side all along. Janet, though, waited until the hallway was empty before catching up to me. "You made your choice," she said, her voice low. But you're not done here. The grant's still ours to use if we can fund the match another way. And I have alternatives. I didn't ask what that meant. I've learned enough in the past few months to know that when someone like Janet says alternatives, it usually involves more strings than they admit up front. Still, she was right. We had a grant approval hanging over us and a clock ticking down. Over the next few weeks, the town calmed down, but the committee didn't. New proposals came in, smaller fundraising goals, scaled-back projects, and even a joint plan for Mark and Doris to combine lighting upgrades with a modest garden expansion. It wasn't flashy, but it was doable without selling land or giving up tax revenue. In the end, we went with that plan. The grant got matched, the park got improvements, and no one's name ended up carved on a pavilion plaque. It wasn't a win for any one person, it was a compromise. Looking back, I realized I'd gone in thinking I could keep my head down. But in a small town, even sitting quietly in the corner makes you part of the fight. And once you've taken a side, whether you mean to or not, people remember.